Oh hey, it's the channel's 8th anniversary since I have returned. Actually, cut the montage. Should I even still be doing this? Feels a bit in poor taste, all things considered.
These anniversary videos are meant to be a celebratory affair, but there's not much to get one in such a positive mindset given the lack of production on the channel and how generally awful 2020 was for so many reasons. Not that I'm expecting 2021 to be much better, but maybe we'll get that genealogy remake that they've been teasing for a while? Maybe Metroid Prime 4? Look, it's been a pretty bad year for me personally. Just let me have this.
Sort of like peppermint patty now. I really need to get a haircut.
The realm of video games wasn't immune to what seemed like an endless stream of miserable news stories breaking out day after day, with an ever-increasing amount of tales of truly abominable working conditions and systemic harassment within major game studios, as well as a certain award show rewarding studios for their managerial failures.
The Game of the Year award goes to The Last of Us Part 2.
And while far less significant than the systemic crunch or Ubisoft literally protecting abusers, it was an especially bad year for video games preservation, with two of Nintendo's biggest releases being available only for a limited time.
I've already gone over this in my Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light review, but what makes this particular era especially excruciating to witness is that it wasn't always like this. Don't get me wrong, Nintendo is a corporation. They're not your friend and never should be treated as such. That being acknowledged, there was a time, however brief, when Nintendo's motivations aligned with the games preservation movement, at least to an extent. They were still issuing DMC claims on sites that would offer ROMs of their games, when they were more focused on a long-term strategy and saw the financial benefit of having a storefront that offered older games in their catalogs to a new audience on their recently released systems, thus creating the Virtual Console on the Nintendo Wii. It was far from perfect. Releases would stagnate to a truly astounding extent, even more so on the Wii U. Prices were equally ludicrous given the general ease of emulation on PC, but the concept of the Virtual Console allowed for relatively straightforward distribution of games that would otherwise require an original copy and a compatible system, all without having to download them from a site that had perhaps dubious motivations.
And unlike the current Nintendo Switch Online offerings, once you bought a game on the Virtual Console, like, say, Castlevania 3, it was yours to own forever instead of essentially renting it out. That's right. Nintendo is your video game landlord. And they know it. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Nintendo Switch Online.
One of the minor parts to appreciate about the Virtual Console is that it wasn't just limited to games released in a particular region. The storefront saw a fair number of games come westward that were either limited in exposure or never released in North America, like Sin and Punishment on the Nintendo 64, Battle Roadrunner on the TurboGrafx 16, and today's title, Pulseman for the SEGA Genesis. Released in 1994, Pulseman was originally developed by the fine folks over at, of all game companies, Game Freak. It might be hard to believe this, but the halcyon days of the Pokémon developer weren't drenched with success. Really, that series was more the exception, as original titles like Smart Ball and Clickmedic were given neither critical nor commercial acclaim around the world, while more memorable affairs like Mario and Wario were relegated to the land of the rising sun shores and no more. Mendel Palace and Yoshi were the only global success stories that they saw, and even the former of the two was more a modest hit. Not to mention it was in spite of significant changes that were made to the localized version and, to put it mildly, the troubled development cycle of the entire game.
Pulseman was also not particularly successful, at least for the time. While it did receive relatively positive reviews from outlets, sales figures aren't available, and much like the aforementioned Mario and Wario, it never did see a Western release, so one can imagine it didn't exactly fly off of store shelves.
Well, bit of a half-truth, it didn't see a physical release. See, back in the 90s, Nintendo and Sega were experimenting with delivering digital versions of their titles to their respective consoles via optional peripherals and services. Sega's version of this, the creatively named Sega Channel, was a blockbuster-like subscription service that would let customers, among other features that were offered, play a rotating selection of Genesis titles, some of which were games that were never given a physical release in North America, like Treasure's truly underappreciated Alien Soldier, and, of course, Pulseman. All things considered, the SEGA channel was surprisingly successful for its time, with around 250,000 subscribers at its peak. However, it was incredibly expensive even for the time, and short-lived. Ironic given how long SEGA tried to keep the Genesis alive for with all the extra peripherals that they added onto it, like the 32X and CD, only lasting for about 3 years before SEGA went on to flail about in the mid-90s with the botched release of the SEGA Saturn. In any case, Pulseman did have a limited release in North America, and it would be one of Game Freak's final affairs on home console until the Let's Go duology in 2018, falling into relative obscurity despite the meteoric rise of some franchise that they made, Digital Monsters or something. It became the cult phenomenon, I don't know, until being re-released globally on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007. So that history lesson is fine and dandy, but does this Genesis game hold up to this very day? Did it ever hold up to begin with? Let's find out if Pulseman is worthy of being anything more than a footnote in Game Freak's gamography. Game Freak's game... That's such a pain to say. That really is. The story of Pulseman begins with his creator, Dr. Yoshiyama, falling in love with his recently created AI and sending himself to the digital world where the two of them make a baby named Pulseman. After staying in the digital world too long, Yoshiyama becomes corrupted somehow? It's not exactly clear how this happens, but he becomes Dr. Waruyama and founds a criminal organization called the Galaxy Gang that wreaks havoc across the globe, and it's up to Pulseman to stop them and his estranged father from destroying it. The tale is nothing particularly special. Like with most platformers of the time, Pulseman is more interested in crafting unique levels for the player to traverse than using its gameplay or level design to tell an interesting story. To say nothing of how little connective tissue there is between the game's individual levels and the overarching story. Any readings into a deeper message is stretching out what little material does exist. Like, yeah, you can read into Sonic as a metaphor for environmentalism, but it's not a particularly deep take on the subject, at least not compared to the comics in the show. And it certainly doesn't compare to the likes of Final Fantasy VI or Terra Enigma. The most one can read into Pulseman is that the titular character is symbolic of how technological advancements can make one's lives easier, with him literally solving all the world's problems, while also acknowledging that these advancements come with their own hurdles in the form of the opposing Waruyama and how he manipulates it. It's a good message, it's one that's becoming far more relevant these days. But the way the message is portrayed in the game is... well, it's not exactly Lynchian storytelling. Also, the consent between the Doctor and his creation is... dubious at best. The gameplay, on the other hand, wait. This is the music for choosing a stage? This slaps so hard that it breaks the sound barrier. Game Freak veteran Junichi Masuda worked on the game's compositions, and they are terrific. The Genesis was not known for having the most stellar sound chip, but this score does an amazing job of capturing the feel that you're exploring a digital world, with its heavy focus on beats, bass, and ambience that matches the energy of the graphics in a way that comes as close to perfect as one can get. The entire game has such a wonderful presentation to it. The visuals are vibrant, and the levels have an astounding attention to detail. When I first got to this part of level 6, I didn't even notice that the not-so-good Doctor was pressing the button on the controller in the foreground before the missiles were launched in the mid. Pulseman and his mother, who's in his wristwatch, has some rather lively animations, with Pulseman boasting very charming idols. He's just waiting for you to get going, but he won't make a stink about it, unlike some inconsiderate hedgehog. The sprite work does a great job of showing the character's personality. Just look at how he teeters near the edge of this platform, it's adorable. Quite a stark contrast to the company's later 2D efforts in, say, Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, where static sprites were seldom subjected to slowdown. As in, sprites that did not move would be subjected to slowdown during you or your opponent's attack. Mind you, Pulseman also has its share of slowdown, but it's at least acceptable given how gorgeous the game looks. The only major problem is that some of the stage's visuals can be a bit... busy? The later ones in particular can wear on your eyes with some truly trippy visuals. I'm honestly not sure it's a good idea to show them in this video, or at least certain sections of them. Not helped by the constant darkening and lightening of the screen, with Pulseman using his Voltecker technique. All in all, the presentation is generally solid, but how does the game actually play? Surprisingly well, as it turns out. If you're familiar with other platformers that came out at around the same time, then Pulseman's momentum and general movement can take a bit of time to adjust to. It's not like Super Mario Bros. Where there's a gradual slowdown when one takes the finger off the control, or friction when one changes direction. Pulseman more or less stops moving once you do that, and doesn't carry over any momentum when he changes directions. While momentum for one's running will carry over to any jumps that Pulseman performs, it's the electricity that he builds up by doing so that finds the most usage, as the charge that they generate can be unleashed in a ranged attack, or through his Voltecker technique, an ability that launches Pulseman into the air at a 45-degree angle, destroying most enemies in his way, and bouncing them off of solid surfaces. You can also build up this bolt by quickly tapping to the left or right, but it's tricky to pull off in a pinch. That said, doing it this way does boast some utility through making the titular character temporarily invincible. The Voltecker has a limited range, and Pulseman himself has a limited repertoire, but the levels make the most of them with intricate designs that truly test the player's understanding of the Voltecker and the character's other abilities. Mostly. I only ever found use for the flip kick on the final boss, and it makes the encounter all too easy. That said, the majority of the levels, and the sections that make up each of them, have that wonderful Kirby-esque quality to them. In as much as the basics are easy to grasp, but it's a real challenge to master the mechanics of the Voltecker and the quick attack, and fully explore each level, figuring out just how far you can push it. There are a ton of secrets to find, and full sections of each stage that you can skip if you know how to use the Voltecker to bounce off the right surface at the precise angle. These secret areas and how to get past the normal areas are completely optional, but they add in what I like to call an alternative challenge. Finding a shortcut that the developers intentionally left for the player to discover is a good way to incentivize them to better grasp the Voltecker in the earlier stages to see what sort of advanced areas they can discover in the later stages. And it's incredibly rewarding to uncover a spot with an extra life or one of 10 goodies that will grant you one. It's also the closest the game has to replayability since it's a relatively short series of 7 stages, although it's culminating in climactic boss fights. Some of these are rather subversive, in that they require far more patience to pin down when to attack, as opposed to the more quick-paced platforming in prior portions, but they're all relatively challenging, again except for the final boss if you just spam the jump kick. There's only a few sore spots to be found in Pulseman, and most of them have to do with the final 2 levels, or at least how those final 2 levels interact with the other mechanics. While you can do the first 3 levels and then later 4 through 6 in any order that you want, you do have to go through all of them in order to move on to the next set of stages. Unless you have a second controller, in which case you can just flat out choose which stage that you want, which I wasn't able to do. There's a particularly obnoxious section in stage 6, the obligatory water level, where Pulseman has to drop to the bottom of the ocean, avoiding any and all obstacles before they reach it. Or at least, try to, with how little of what's lurking beneath can actually be seen, and your general inability to defend yourself when in the water. Most of the game's levels, heck most of the sections within this level, don't have this amount of vertical descension to them, and the complete inability to use your usual arrays of abilities in the water only adds to the frustration since you can only see so little of what's below, you can't even crouch down to see more of it. Not helped by how many spikes and these proto-Rimmery looking mechs can take out your health before you get anywhere near the bottom, or the utter lack of recovery power-ups. Stage 7 also has its annoying interactions with the game's basics. Knockback is a pain to deal with in most games of this time period, since it potentially puts you in harm's way, or it knocks you into a pit that you couldn't avoid.
Which, by the by, we all realize that this design choice originates in the arcades, right? That it was done deliberately on the developer's part to make the machine seem more appealing, because they can suck more quarters out of kids' pockets. And that it's really awful in hindsight that we let it stick around for as long as it did, and as many games as this appeared in, many of which did not originate in the arcades.
But it's manageable in its irritation in Pulseman, since you're invincible for a short time after you hit the ground or come into contact with an obstacle, so you usually have enough time to recover from a particularly spiky landing. Not so here, since there's a plethora of pitfalls that will instantly kill you, and foes ready to knock you into them, and no, you can't activate your Voltecker or side dash to recover from your fall. While previous stages have had instant death pits, those ones were more focused on platforming the combating foes flying towards you, so it felt fair if you ended up dying because you missed a jump. Thankfully, you don't have to do the entire stage over again, even if you do run out of lives, assuming you still have a continue to burn. The last 2 levels bearing such a spiky difficulty fruit did sour my overall experience with Pulseman, but not to the extent that it ruined the experience. It's a terrific done one that showed a lot of promise for Game Freak's future. Which makes it an even greater shame that it never did take off. One can only imagine the potential of a sequel.
Ken Sugimori, another Game Freak veteran, has said that they're interested in returning to Pulseman at some point, but that was years ago and there's been nothing that's come out of it. Until then, we're just stuck with the original.
While the title has been largely forgotten by the gaming public, Game Freak certainly remembers one of their final console creations, as Pulseman has had quite the legacy within the Pokémon series. There's the obvious homage with Pikachu's signature move, Volt Tackle, looking similar to Pulseman's Voltecker, but Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum are particularly brimming with references, from musical motifs mimicking the Sublime score on Pulseman, to seeing Galactic being a pastiche of the Galaxy Gang, their leader is literally obsessed with technology, and the Runiforms being reminiscent of the titular character's ability to jump in and out of electronics. Game Freak would, of course, go on to create the most lucrative franchise of all time, Pokémon, and they continue to make the mainline entries in that series to this very day. They still make non-Pokémon games with far more frequency than they did during the early 2000s, but to be perfectly frank, they're not great. The last one that I'd unequivocally recommend would be Drill Dozer, and that game came out well over a decade ago. Still, the fact that they even bothered to experiment is something that is appreciated. It's just a shame that they haven't been able to deliver a title on the same level as Pulseman. Not that you would know, because trying to play it nowadays is a tricky affair. As mentioned earlier, it was made available on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007, but with that system's shop shut down, Pulseman is practically in the same position it was before the Wii era. The only option outside of a reproduction card or a combination of an original copy and a Genesis model that can accommodate the Japanese cartridge is resorting to the same solution, that the problem that the lack of general preservation efforts for the video game medium presents: emulation. And it's more of a downer ending than I originally planned for, but I digress. Thanks for joining me for yet another anniversary. As for what's in store for the rest of the channel this year, well, I don't want to promise anything that I can't deliver this time, so I'll just say stay tuned for a whole month that goes back to a time before time.
Oh yeah, I also built a new PC, so hopefully gonna be a little bit more productive now that I have a desktop. Probably gonna make a video on it, but not exactly a cheap PC, and if you aren't aware, actually getting the parts to build one is a little bit tricky, so it'd be in poor taste to release one now, so I'm gonna put that one off for a month or so at least.